Well, hi everyone. My name is Sandy Davis. I'm a senior advisor here at BPC, and I've had the great privilege to help lead the project on local innovations for economic opportunity here at BPC. It's been a tremendous experience and really inspiring to learn of the stories like what we just heard of the really key local innovations, people taking the bull by the horns, so to speak, fixing problems in their area. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the BPC team who helped work on this. Tim Shaw, Senior Policy Analyst, Dora Engel, Project Associate for this exercise, and Carolyn Cooper, who makes all this go. So thanks so much to the BPC team who worked on this. Also have to thank especially, you've heard mention that we worked with NACO specifically on this to help find the local innovations and learn of the great initiatives going on around the country, working with Matt's team, Senna Baig and Hadi Sadai and Cheryl Burnett over there, with tremendous partners in this work, and we couldn't have done it without them, really. We will be respectful of everyone's time. Thanks for hanging in with us to our drama. But what we want to do on this panel is sort of take a step back, and apropos of the last question of the panel, sort of take a look at how should we think about a broadly supportive policy structure for local innovations and state innovations that we've learned about around the country. And as we're in the first panel, we heard about these key initiatives. What we want to do is sort of have a conversation about what are the ways to sort of create a supportive, in particular, federal policy environment in which these kinds of innovations can flourish and be replicated and scaled up around the country. To do that, I am really pleased to be joined by the two executive directors of two of the leading state and local associations, part of the so-called Big Seven of state and local associations, who think about and work on these issues all the time. To my immediate left, Matt Chase, of course, Executive Director of National Association of Counties, that is a member representative organization for 3,069 counties. Is that right?
Parishes and boroughs.
Parishes and boroughs around the country. And as Jason mentioned, these are really the representative incubators of what's going on around the country. They're urban, they're rural, they're large, they're small, conservative, progressive. It's a real test case of what's going on around the country. So welcome to Matt. To Matt's left is my good friend Scott Pattison, who is the Executive Director of the National Governors Association, the organization, the bipartisan organization that represents the nation's governors. And NGA really is, I'd like to say, a hotbed of innovation under Scott's leadership. And with the various chairs initiatives in recent years, there's been a real focus on state-based innovation and ideas that can be shared around the country. There's a tremendous Center on Best Practices at NGA, which focuses on sharing best practices of some of these innovations and great ideas and creative ideas for addressing this range of policy issues that we've been talking about. So with the help of these two gentlemen, I think that we've got the ground covered between the states and the counties. I think we've got a lot of the ground covered on what's going on around the country. And what I would like to do, one further thing I have to say before moving on, another shout out to these two organizations, because they really are truly bipartisan in a sense. And I've been at events of both, and they really create what I like to call a safe space for these public servants, the nation's executives, governors and county executives, to sort of do what they want to do anyway, and I think that is solve problems for people. And it's a really great example of how this should work, especially in the environment that we live in D.C. these days. So what I would like to do with these gentlemen is, as I said, take a step back and think about what a supportive sort of broader policy framework looks like to support innovations around the country at the state and local level. I'll frame it like this, and then let them sort of each make comments to get things going. There's a new task force on intergovernmental relations that was started by Speaker Ryan and Democratic leader Pelosi last year to look at issues of how to reinvigorate federalism, how to look at how we can restore a more effective intergovernmental relationship among the different levels of government in this country. And both NACO and NGA are on the advisory council of the task force, and both testified last year at the task force when it was kicked off. what I would ask you, looking at 50,000-foot level, is as you think about your testimony last year, as you think about your interactions with federal policymakers, what sort of do you, from your perspectives, think is sort of the condition of the intergovernmental relationship right now? And how should we think about, from your organization's perspectives, creating a more productive relationship with states, localities, that could create sort of the incentives for more innovations like this to flourish? How's that for a broad question? So, Matt, I'm going to let you start off, and then you can go across the
Well, thank you again to the Bipartisan Policy Center and to Rockefeller for giving us the space and the partnership to pursue this. I'm going to frame my conversation around the economic security theme of this event and limit it, because both states and counties are involved in so many different activities. As far as the intergovernmental system, you use the term federalism. There's even a debate, can we even use that word? Is that a negative word? Because in some parts of the country, it's viewed in a derogatory sense. For us as counties, we are creatures of state government, but I do remind the federal government and our state partners, the first shire, if you remember Robin Hood and our history, the first shire was actually created in this country in 1634. So counties predate states and the federal government. And we were really, the shires were the arm of the king to deliver local services, and now we're the local delivery services for Scots members, the kings of states known as governors. But we are the practitioners on the ground. So NACO, we represent 40,000 elected officials. So 20,000 are policymakers, like the county commissioners, county executives, and 20,000 are what we call constitutional officers, sheriffs, district attorneys, public defenders, sometimes judges, clerks, and others. We're a $600 billion a year business, if you will. So the 3,069 counties, if you took us together, combined our budgets, about $600 billion a year in local investment. We have 3.6 million employees. Just in the human service space alone, we have about 250,000 county employees working on social service programs every day. The point being that we have really nowhere to hide. Folks like the commissioner and the sergeant are on the ground working on these. So when it comes to intergovernmental, what we are asking now is to not be treated like a special interest group. Both the Congress and the White House like to call us lobbyists or an interest group. We're not. We are intergovernmental partners serving the same communities and the same constituents. And what we are constantly trying to push for is space to innovate and take risks. Most of these programs, regardless of what party's in control, are managing federal programs through compliance and through the Inspector General's office. And that does not allow practitioners on the ground any sort of risk-taking, particularly with elected officials who are, as an elected official, your job is to minimize risk. Right. So it's really challenging. We're really trying to get our federal partners to realize we're delivering these on the services on the ground, we're serving the same people, and to communicate with us and to work with us and to use our local laboratories, whether it's a state level or a county level, to try new things.
Mm-hmm. Scott?
Oh. Well, I think there have been some good signs in that you do have this intergovernmental task force that has been created. So I think there are some kernels of things that have occurred. I have some examples very recently on both education policy and particularly the opioid crisis, in which you're seeing some folks working together. But you still have as Matt talked about, you still have the challenge, and it's been going on for decades and decades. But I do agree. I think the most important thing, and we keep trying to make this very clear to the administration and Congress, regardless of who's in power, that we're not just another advocacy group on a list, that we are in the Constitution. We are other levels of government that can be an important part of the implementation of the policies the federal government wants to implement, whatever they are. And I also like to point out that a third of all funds that are, or a third of all state funds are federal funds that they are overseeing and administering to try to provide outcomes that the federal government is mandating. So we're all an important part of, if we want to get to an outcome like solving the opioid crisis, we have to have it done at the state and local and federal level working together. And understand, and the final thing I'll say right now is, and we all know this, but we have to see it really operate in practice. What works for Arizona is not necessarily what's going to work for Vermont. And there has to be, that we hear rhetorically that brought up all the time, but I don't often see true implementation and understanding, particularly at the federal level, that we have to understand that what you do in even a part of Arizona is different from another part. And it's certainly different among states.
So thinking about, so you heard the conversations that we've had so far, and you you gentlemen have these conversations with governors, with county executives, all the time. And this sort of informs your sort of organization's agendas as well. So I'm curious if you'd like to share sort of a little bit more. You referenced a couple of things that NGA is doing, Scott. So hearing about these ideas, if you'd reference sort of the broader set of initiatives leadership initiatives you may have going that thank you, that sort of focus on these key issues of economic opportunity and trying to deal with economic insecurity.
Sure. I'll start. 5 years ago, we started a website called the County Explorer, and today it has over 600 data indicators on it that we built it originally for the media. Mm-hmm. And what we quickly discovered is our own members were using it. And one of the first products that we developed was called the County Economic Tracker, because so much of the federal data focuses on the larger counties. And we developed this economic indicators with 4 different indicators: unemployment, employment, median household income, and GDP. GDP is really hard to get for some of the smaller jurisdictions, but why we did it was to really talk to our members about there's no such thing as status quo in a community. Right. And that just like individuals, you have to invest and you have to nurture your family, your individuals, but also as communities. And what we found, and this was coming out of the Great Recession, was it took the large urban counties quite a while to rebound. The first community to actually rebound was Kent County, Michigan, which always stuns people that Kent County, which is Grand Rapids, was the first county to rebound in those 4 indicators, all 4. And a lot of it was really solid education, diversified economy, really smart local decision making, more conservative in nature, so they're not big spenders. But our point in this county economic indicator was so many of our communities are fragile. And particularly the smaller communities, we were seeing their one manufacturing plant from shutting down, or with the coal transition away from coal, we were seeing communities almost disappear, right. Particularly their property tax base. And so we started that, and then as we got into it, what we discovered was our members were ready to not wait for the federal government with all the answers, or the states, and hopefully in collaboration with the states. So we moved on to some other things, and the sergeant knows this. Our county jails, we see about 12 million individuals a year in county jail. By comparison, there's about 1 million people in state prisons. So 1/12 the size of what we're seeing on a rotating basis. And what we discovered was we were warehousing those with mental illness and substance abuse. And that these weren't criminals, these were nuisances in the community that folks didn't like, and so they called the police, they got arrested and got them out of their neighborhoods. We took a data-driven initiative and said, 1, let's figure out who actually has mental health challenges or substance abuse and are in the jail. We're hiring more nurses now in our jails than officers. And we started to get the counties to adopt resolutions to say, we're not going to wait for the states or the federal government to solve this. Right. We're going to start doing it ourselves. And I can talk about some more later, but the early childhood piece has now evolved. We've gotten into early childhood development, and which is something new for us. And a lot of it came through our law enforcement. The sheriffs and others saying one of the indicators that engineers were using for jail capacity was 2nd and 5th grade reading levels as a predictive indicator on how much jail space will you need. It's not the only, but it was one. And so we looked at where were the gaps in the system, and 0 to 3 was really a blind spot, as Linda talked about. 3 to 5, there's a lot of initiative, but the brain is already formed by 3 years old. So I can talk a little bit more about those things, but it's all coming through this lens of multi-generational poverty, that as the social safety net providers, we're seeing the same families over and over. And so our leadership has said, how are we going to put more effort into looking at breaking that multi-generational cycle of poverty? And I'll just wrap up by saying, one of the things we found in our economic indicators is, are we in an economic evolution or an economic revolution? And you take a Shelby County, Tennessee, where Memphis is, 38% of their jobs are tied to transportation logistics. 38%. Home of FedEx, it makes sense. Spencer knows that, who's here and worked in the Delta Regional Authority. With autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles, how many folks are FedEx really going to need for truck drivers for the distribution and logistics of that hub? Already one of the most economically disadvantaged cities in the nation. It's only going to get worse because they're at that skills level where they're their most vulnerable. And so a lot of that came out of us looking nationally. Where were these communities resilient? You think of resilient in a disaster sense, but you also need to think of it in an economic sense.
Well, and I'll say too that following up on that, I think one of the most important issues is this economic opportunity issue, and a lot of the things you talked about really fit into that. Every governor that I've had a meeting with or talked to in the last 6 months has brought that up, and the skills gap and all the associated aspects of that. So we did two things at the National Governors Association recently in response to what governors are talking about that's very critical, the economic opportunity. One is we created an economic opportunity section as part of the best practices group to try to make sure that we're out there working with senior policy advisors to governors and talking about what can they do and sharing what works. And so one of those projects I'm really proud of is the 2-generational project that we've done. Now, I've been telling the folks at the office I think it ought to be 3-generational. But we really are trying to talk about, okay, you want to deal with the skills gap of the parent and educational and other opportunities, but you also want to talk about childcare like Linda talked about. So we want to talk about kind of those things together. And what this has led to is some really exciting things. In fact, our incoming chair, Steve Bullock, the Montana governor, just signed an executive order on Friday, which actually is a big deal about really doing everything possible to deal with the skills gap in a state like Montana. I was just there about a month ago. We had a meeting about the workforce, and it was fascinating to see in a state like Montana the types of tough issues they have with people who are in small towns, and the types of jobs that they need to get the skills for are not necessarily what they have the skills for. So I think there are some exciting opportunities, but these are huge challenges. And as Mike talked about in the prior in a question, the prior panel, is there are short-term things, but a lot of these things are long-term and they're going to take years. And I'll also say we created in response to the governor's request something called NGA Future, which is to get, again, economic advisors and education advisors to the governors together to talk about what works. Because as you say, they're starting to realize, wow, 3 to 5 years from now, I could have a huge issue with a good technology of autonomous vehicles that adds a lot of positive things for society, like bringing the elderly to their doctor's appointments, but may displace a lot of people who are currently employed driving vehicles. So there are all kinds of issues that we have to start thinking about now, because they're going to hit really soon.
You know, thank you. So what sort of comes through both of your sets of comments is, you know, the gathering of data, performance measures, indicators of success, and in looking at, you know, talking to folks at the county level and other folks around the country, it's clear there's a sort of a wide disparity on both capacity and ability to use some data, collect it, to use it to evaluate programs and figure out where the gaps are. I mean, I think that Many of the states have been at the leading edge of sort of what we call evidence-based policymaking and using data to inform policy decisions, and have organizations and agencies that sort of focus on this and leadership. We've heard some great examples. Lori from Multnomah County, we consider her like at the cutting edge of the use of data, and Linda talked about the project and the use in Maricopa County. But that, I don't know if your sense is that's more the exception than the rule, or if you see a need for a broader effort to help produce the data, help the counties, the states come up with the data that they can use to sort of both find out what the gaps are, but also use this to sort of create the conditions for broader political agreement. If we can all agree on what the facts are, then what the path forward may be. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'll jump on this one. We are swimming in data. What we need is knowledge. We need the ability to have the right analytics. And I'll take the opioid crisis since we've been talking about it. Erie County, New York, which is Buffalo, is at the cutting edge of this crisis. The county executive there, along with the coroner and others, they are finding new chemicals. Yeah. These are not, at this point, pharma-produced opioids. These are Mexican gangs hiring Chinese chemists to make fentanyl derivatives opioids. It's not heroin anymore. It's fentanyl laced. The county coroner has actually identified new chemicals that aren't in the state controlled substance database or the FDA database. These are brand new chemicals that didn't. Now, why did they do that? Because the cartels can make 1,000% more heroin with this fentanyl than through the traditional. Well, there's the science involved in that and the data, but they're now linking it with law enforcement data to look at households, and similar to Lucas County, they're bringing wraparound services. And one, they're trying to educate them on, this is not your old batches of heroin, this is lethal, it's gonna kill you. But two, they've looped this into their economic innovation and economic security initiatives, because when you look at the neighborhoods, there are neighborhoods that have lost hope, and obviously there are others using opioids through doctor prescribed and others, but they're able to target places that are being left further and further behind. And Buffalo is a classic example of an old booming city in the 50s and 60s that fell into disrepair and is now on a rebound. And they have this unique position where they don't have enough jobs. They don't have enough workers for their job vacancies, and yet they have this opioid epidemic that's robbing them of their workforce. And so their whole philosophy is, we need to turn this around. It's a cultural problem. Mm-hmm. And there's some legal issues, there's some federal policy issues with Medicaid and Medicare, but it's really hitting places hard that have lost economic opportunity. Right. And so, again, they've linked this opioid crisis together with their economic development strategy. Mm-hmm. of how do you go back into these neighborhoods and give people aspiration. And they are using data not only on the chemical side, but to go in and pinpoint neighborhoods for investment.
Right.
And I find too, and I have to praise the the Bipartisan Center and Sandy Davis and his folks for a lot of good work on evidence-based and outcome measurement type activities, because it's absolutely critical. Mm-hmm. I think several things on this. I've been involved in this for so many years, even when I worked years ago in the state of Virginia, and my frustration continues to be, as you say, we're swimming in data, Matt, and so we've got to step back and stop making it so complicated, because what happens is I think civil servants and others just step back and they get overwhelmed. I think we have to say, how can we use some of this data in a fairly simple way that can really create the outcomes that we want? And they're exciting examples. I see them all the time. The governor of Indiana, governor of Ohio have really attacked infant mortality very specifically in trying to pinpoint the geographic locations where that's a problem. And it's really starting to be effective. And so if we can figure out how can we also do that, when I was in Montana and talking to Governor Bullock, the same type of thing. They were trying to pinpoint where certain jobs are and what kind of skills are needed. And that's the type of thing that we need to think about. In Tennessee, when I was down in the governor's office there, they said they were trying to find out where certain jobs were and how long the commute was. So they were basically going to places and saying, you live in a rural area, but there's a need for plumbers in this greater Nashville area. You may have to drive an hour, but believe me, you can get a good paying job. How can we make that happen? How can we get you the skills to become a certified plumber if that's what you want to do? So if we can really think about the data and the evidence, it really can work. But we've got to stop making it this over-complex type of activity that I think does not become useful.
You're preaching to the choir, that's for sure. Okay.
One thing with data in this space that helps is so many of the programs, particularly the federal programs, are siloed, and yet you're serving the same resident. And so the same household may be using TANF dollars, SNAP dollars, which are food stamps, they may be on Medicaid or veterans, and yet federal government, state governments, counties, we treat them separately, like it's not serving the same person. And so going back to both mental health and the opioid crisis, one of our biggest challenges with the federal government is under the Social Security Act, you lose your veterans benefits and your Medicaid benefits at arrest, not being adjudicated and convicted or pleading out. And so think of the dollars that are wasted with those with bipolar or schizophrenic when they go into a jail. They're off their meds for a while until we can figure it out. And then when they're discharged, they go back on Medicaid, but it takes 60 to 90 days or 120 days. And people wonder why they have a high recidivist rate. Well, this person is not being treated consistently and is constantly going off their medications and their treatment, whereas it would be a lot more efficient to have a stable continuity of care approach. And so what we find is poverty is expensive for the government, and poverty costs money. And so we're spending so much time just sustaining these folks and rather than empowering them.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that we're trying to work on is how do we integrate the different programs. And in some cases like Pennsylvania, the counties worked with the state and they said, we'll take less money for increased flexibility, and they're finding better outcomes because they can really tailor their services to their, I hate to use the word clients, but their residents.
Well, that's very interesting. I see we're sort of at the witching hour, 4 o'clock, so I hope we have time for 2 questions, 3 maybe. So, you guys hung in with us this far. We don't want to cut you off and not give you a chance to ask these gentlemen questions. So let's take a few questions, 3, maybe 4 if they're quick. If anybody wants to take the opportunity to, yes.
Lori Stegman, Multnomah County. I appreciate the conversation. What can counties and local government do to get the federal government to allow those folks that are being incarcerated to not lose their Medicaid benefits? Because you're absolutely right, but what can we do at the local level to change that policy?
Well, we need to continue to educate them that it would be cost efficient. Because right now, I always say to the Republicans on this issue, if you support the Constitution, you support the Constitution. And due process is one of those. Because right now, you're losing your veterans benefits and your Medicaid at arrest, as I said. In the Constitution, you really should be given due process. You shouldn't be presumed guilty. You should go through a process. The challenge there is the cost. And so the view is, well, if counties are paying for health care in the county jails, why should the federal government pick it up? When the language was written, the federal policymakers didn't understand the difference between prisons and jails. And they thought if you were in a county jail, you were already found guilty. They didn't realize that 80% of our inmates are pre-trial. They're waiting to see a judge, they're waiting to be tried. And it was a drafting error. But now the costs have become so great. One of the opioid bills that's going through would encourage states to suspend Medicaid, not terminate, which saves some time. But again, you should stay on Medicaid until you're convicted or at least adjudicated. And we say if we are holding folks that have been convicted, then we'll pay. But if they're pretrial, then we shouldn't. So it's an education process, and the challenge is that the Congressional Budget Office score is going to be so great that if we need offsets, how do we get that through? But we got to keep educating them. And it goes back to evidence showing that it's cheaper to treat folks continuously rather than on this roller coaster.
Right. Any thoughts?
And NGA actually supports us on this.
Other questions? So we'll go to this gentleman in the back, and then Linda.
Spencer Lucker with Delta Regional Authority. Thanks for the shout out about Memphis and Shelby County. So we're talking about the faults of the federal policy and federal government.
You are, we're not.
Or sorry, no. The disconnect. I
Trying
guess
to keep
is
it
a better
positive,
term.
right?
Disconnect rather than fault.
Yeah.
So are there programs, agencies, policies that have been changed in the past 3 to 5 years that with that work with NGA, NACO, NLC, you're seeing changes that are helping y'all on the county level, at the state level, so that you are solving some of those disconnects? It's easy for federal agencies to say, oh, well, we're doing this wrong. It would be great to fix it, but have we fixed anything yet? Are there any cases, best practices, or cases of success so far that you can point to?
Well, I guess what I'll say is I think there are analogous situations which are really positive. Just yesterday, we were very pleased we were able to get a change in the Senate bill on education that gives more flexibility at the state level to governors, which I think what we've just been talking about is really, really positive, because it allows you to do that more place-based focus where what might work in Arizona might be different than Vermont and so forth. So I think that's positive. I think taking the education example further, the Every Student Succeeds Act has given us more local flexibility. It's those types of things that I think are positive, and they're good analogies for other things we can do that can be really positive.
I would say one area is actually the coal project, where the Appalachian Regional Commission and others, the governors, federal government, and the counties have worked on, if because of market forces or just social policy, we're going to move away from coal impacted or coal generated power, there needs to be a transition. And we've worked with the governors and the federal government to help those communities transition, because I'll take a county we have in Montana. 80% of their property tax for the county and the school system come from a coal plant. And this is a part of the state where they don't have tourism. And they're told, just transition. Well, we're in eastern Montana. We've got 10,000 people in a county the size of Rhode Island. Our school funding is disappearing because of this. And they're not fighting migration to renewable energy, but the economics and the tax revenue from that are totally different than a coal power plant. And so Sana and others have worked with these communities to say, hey, you're going to have to keep evolving, and there's going to be a painful transition period. And I think that coal program is a great example of the federal government, states, locals, nonprofits, the business community coming together and saying, we're going to need to transition. And we're also seeing that, I think, in the disaster space, where last year I was telling these guys 25% of all county governments had a FEMA presidential disaster declaration last year. Some of those counties had multiple, not from the same event, but multiple events. And Rockefeller's worked on this, the issue of resilience and doing pre-disaster mitigation is really important, and you're seeing more of that. Some of that's just coming out of necessity. The federal government can't keep appropriating $140 billion a year off budget to bail out communities. And so I think that's a space where we're seeing a lot more conversation, and not just a cost shift, but we need behavior change.
Linda, you had a question.
Yeah, I have a quick question about the balance, I think, between state and county flexibility versus accountability for funds. And I think my question has to do with, years ago we put out there a number of block grants from the federal government. The Child Care Development Block Grant was a big one. Okay. And what we saw happen with the block grant was states not doing the right thing. I mean, we had hundreds of thousands of children in unsafe, unhealthy care because there was no licensing, no oversight, no health standards, no nothing. So how do you really, and I get the issue of the need for local innovation flexibility, but how do you balance these two things where the federal government needs to have some accountability for these dollars with the state and the local need to have flexibility in how they design this? I struggle with this all the time, and I'm curious what you think of it.
Well, I'll say real quick that I do too. I think that's always an issue, and we always joke, we're states and counties, states and localities are always going to have tension, just like we have with the federal government. That'll never go away because none of us will have the ultimate authority. That being said, I think in talking with a lot of state officials over the years, I found that the balance, I think, comes in is definitely hold people, and I mean either at the state or local level, depending on where the funds are going, to a certain level of required outcome. And also within some parameters, we expect, we'll give you flexibility, but we expect a decrease in infant mortality by X% over 5 years. That's fairly specific, but that creates some accountability, or at least if that outcome is not met, a requirement that there has to be an analysis as to why, and then further decision making. So I think it's that, and also safety parameters. If like you're saying, with children are in unsafe environments, well, there need to be parameters to prevent that. But we still feel we need a lot of flexibility. Just tell us where you want to go, not how to get there.
So I think we can take one more quick one. Is there one over here in the back? Yes.
Hi, my name is Daniela. I'm a policy fellow at Respectability. I have two questions. My first one is, how is NACO and NGO representing people with disabilities in the workforce? And then my follow-up question is, how do we get the federal government more invested in the economic growth for people in this community?
Good questions.
Well, I will say we have this economic opportunity section, within the National Governors Association, and so as part of that, we have an enormous amount of projects, and I so many I can't even remember them all. But that being said, I mean, I know that part of the activities are, when we're talking about the skills gap, when we're talking about trying to provide jobs for, frankly, everyone, the disability part is an important part of that. It's both in terms of dealing with the disabled and trying to make sure they do have jobs, but also dealing with specific issues that they have. And there may be different child care requirements, or there may be different types of housing requirements. We're also trying to break down the silos so that we know that the housing department's talking to folks in education so that we're not siloed, that you can deal with health issues as part of housing and education issues as part of housing. So it's kind of making sure we're crossing the topic areas so you're not so siloed that you're not dealing with these specific issues that the disabled have, or whatever economic opportunity needs there are.
I would say for counties, it depends on the state and what their charter is, but there are certain states where the counties actually have a mandate to actually work on this, and it would also depend on how you're defining disabled. That's pretty much what we do. We're designed to be the local social safety net, and so I would say just about everything we're doing is targeted to a broader community within the disabled world, and it's, that's how I would say it.
Yeah, very good. So I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. I would like to, before I turn it to Jason to close it out, sum it up a little bit. I mean, Michael did a nice job talking about the key features of what we saw as successful initiatives, talking about the efforts to collaborate with local partners, to use existing resources, local resources as creatively as possible, things of this nature. To that, I would add that, and what you've seen here today is a clear indicator of it, that what also is a key factor in these state and local initiatives is the power of leadership and the importance of leadership. Leadership of local folks like Commissioner Stegman and Sergeant Rogers, the leadership of the governors, and taking, looking for policy solutions in their states, leadership of county executives, looking for innovative solutions. I think the power of leadership is really a key feature of all of this. And I think the power of leadership of organizations like NACO and NGA to sort of help set the tone for these things and make sure that best practices are revealed and shared. So that's a key thing for me. And another key thing is that we've had a wonderful day. We appreciate very much you guys hanging in there with us. Please thank our panelists. And I'm going to turn it over to Jason.
I will simply close by saying we're all in this together. It's a great comfort to have you all here with us. And I think today we've demonstrated as a community our resilience and our efficiency, having weathered a little bit of a surprise to our system this morning. And BPC cares a great deal about trying to bridge kind of the narrative of opportunity and inequality, because fundamentally we think they're the same challenges. And we're going to be working a lot between now and the midterm elections to see if we can try to provide that foundation. And we will be coming back to all of you to help. So thank you very much.